things are happening right now. Things are really happening in regards to, well, Game of Thrones and its legacy, I think is the best way to describe it. So with Game of Thrones season 8 having wrapped up a couple months ago, to very mixed reactions across the board. A lot of people out there hated it, hated everything that happened with it. A lot of people out there enjoyed what happened with it. I'm actually one of those people, but I do understand that there are a number of issues with it, and all of your feelings on it are valid. We just have a difference of opinion, and that's totally okay. But there is, I think anyone, haters and fans, can easily look at the situation as a whole and go, yeah, there's something rotten in Denmark when it comes to how HBO is going to move forward with this particular franchise. Because remember, for a time, there was this whole talk about 5 prequel series for Game of Thrones. It's the most popular show in the world. HBO has literally no reason to stop making it. They have literally no reason to quit doing it whatsoever. They just want to make sure that it's what they need to do. And of course, they've kind of bungled it because certain things have been canceled. It went from like 5 to I believe 3 to 2, and now it's 1 because this just happened a little over 2 hours ago. Game of Thrones prequel pilot starring Naomi Watts not moving forward at HBO, and this was a big thing. This was meant to kind of like right the ship, correct course when it comes to Game of Thrones. They really wanted this show to do well. So let's find out what they're saying here. So the Game of Thrones prequel pilot, starring Naomi Watts, is not going to series. The cast and crew of the pilot were recently informed that HBO had passed on the project. The potential series was set to take place thousands of years prior to the events of the original series. HBO declined to comment. Look, that's telling when HBO declines to comment. They're probably going to put out a statement at some point later today or tomorrow or something. But when you have a situation like this, where the most popular show in the world as of a few months ago is going forward with sequels and prequels and everything else, more series, and then they just quietly pass on it, and then they also decline to comment on that by not releasing a statement. It goes to show you that there was something clearly bad happening. So in addition to Watts, though, the show was going to star Josh Whitehouse, Naomi Ackie, Dennis Go, Julie Campbell Bower, a lot of other people. None of that really matters. However, what was interesting to me, and what I feel the most bad about, is the fact that Jane Goldman here got kind of screwed. Jane Goldman is fantastic in my opinion. She's worked with Matthew Vaughn for years, co-writer of Stardust, co-writer of Kick-Ass, co-writer of X-Men First Class, co-writer of Kingsman. And I love this. I love this woman as a screenwriter. And I was really hoping to see her tackle this show as a showrunner, as well as write the script. And apparently, that's potentially what might have killed it. Now, the project was co-created by her, and it was George R.R. Martin, whose Song of Ice and Fire served as a basis for Game of Thrones. Goldman and Martin wrote the story, with Goldman writing the teleplay. She would also have served as showrunner. She and Martin were executive producers along other people. And it was, there wasn't a lot there that was really known about it. Like they shot it apparently, but it just didn't work out. So according to this, it says, however, it was reported in September that HBO is nearing a pilot commitment for the project, based on the companion book of Game of Thrones, Fire and Blood, which tells the stories of previous Targaryen kings like Aegon the Conqueror, the first ruler of Westeros, and Aegon the Dragonbane, all of whom are ancestors of Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow. So, and that one is still currently in development right now. That one is still currently happening. And I think that a lot of people out there are okay with this. I haven't seen anyone really kind of go, no, as a result of this particular thing happening. I don't think people are that upset. And let's talk about why though, because I feel that there's a lot that happens. So looking over here at the Game of Thrones, there we go, at the Game of Thrones Rotten Tomatoes page, we can see here that a lot of people didn't like it. We have just a tomato meter, 56%, only off of 13 critics though, which is really weird that only 13 critics out of 6,000 that they have, and a lot of those people watch Game of Thrones, is kind of weird to me. But the audience score of 32 based on 13,000 people is definitely something worth paying attention to. That's a lot of people out there that didn't like it. Now, do I feel there's a lot of undue, unnecessary hate towards this particular show during the final season? Yeah, I do. I do think there was a lot of particular hate that was being brought in, and that's just me. But I also think that there was a lack of trust in the brand, because even though people did turn their attention to Dan and Dave and they criticized Dan and Dave, for how they handled it, how they wrote it. There was a line that they said that at the Austin Film Festival this last weekend, where they kind of made like their first appearance. Because if you recall, they were supposed to go to Comic Con and they bailed out of Comic Con, and then they were going to go to Comic Con and then they bailed out last minute, citing scheduling problems. And everyone thought that they were hard at work at Star Wars, and now we find out that they actually bailed out of Star Wars to go to Netflix because Netflix is paying them between 200 and 250 million dollars for a 5-year commitment, which is clearly a lot more money than Star Wars. But the big problem with that, though, is that it felt like Dan and Dave quit the show. They stopped working on the show in order to jump over to Star Wars, even though I think it was already set that they wanted to end it with season 8. And when they were hired, it was February of 2018. So I think there's some dates there that need to be more or less ironed out, I think, or more publicly talked about. But there was confidence in Game of Thrones as a property that definitely lost in regards to the final season. Even though the last episode drew in almost 20 million people watching it on HBO, and it had almost 20 million people pirating it, which is a lot of people, there were clearly a lot of people that were not happy with the way that it ended. There was a massive fan backlash. And as I pointed out multiple times, it's not, I don't think in this case, I don't think they canceled it because of Dan and Dave. I think that's a part of it. I think the fan backlash is a part of it. But if this pilot, which by the way, the pilot for Game of Thrones was so terrible that HBO went back and they reshot the pilot, so we this kind of thing is not uncommon. But I think that it's possible that the way things worked out was that HBO, I think Casey Bloys had lost confidence in the brand, that the pilot of the show wasn't as good as it could have been. And instead of spending more money and more resources to go back and reshoot it, which I think they probably should have done, if in my honest opinion, they probably saw that sales were down, that the fan trust isn't there. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that George R.R. Martin has not finished the books, and that he keeps dividing up his time and he keeps doing other things. And I know that there's people out there who disagree with me on that say, no, 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 George Martin, he was fine. He was great. He was perfect. He had nothing to do with it. It was all Dan and Dave. They screwed up. Well, the truth of the matter is that's not true. That's not accurate. George hasn't published a book in 8 years. And according to Dan and Dave at that Austin Film Festival panel, they simply ran out of material. And that might have been one of the things that led them to end the show when they did. There was a series of failures across the board in regards to Game of Thrones that led it down the final path that it did. And I think that HBO is looking at this going, well, a couple thousand years beforehand, it just maybe isn't really working. And maybe we can do more by trying to tell the story of the Targaryens versus other people that I don't even think the prequel show, this prequel show was set in the Age of Heroes, from what I was being told. So, I think they want to focus more on something that could potentially bring in a larger audience. And there were so many people out there that love Daenerys. Maybe they want to focus on that as being the next step, is focus on the Targaryen civil war in order to then lead into how the Targaryens took over Westeros, and then maybe set the stage for the events of Game of Thrones. Because instead of taking place thousands of years before, it takes place a couple hundred years before, which then feels maybe a little bit better to certain audience members. It's kind of like KOTOR, Knights of the Old Republic, the Star Wars BioWare games are set 4,000 years before the events of A New Hope. And so if those, is 4,000 years, and a lot of fans really like it because they got to go back to that world and it was totally different. And it felt like Star Wars, but it was new because it was old. That could be done here, but I think HBO got cold feet. And at the end of the day, they're kind of only screwing themselves, because I think people out there really do want Game of Thrones. They really do want to see more Game of Thrones. But what they don't want is a rushed final season, which is what we did get. And I think they just lost confidence in the brand. And a lot of that is because of George R.R. Martin not actually finishing it. I mean, he had the time to write the story with Jane Goldman for this show, but he didn't have time to finish the last 2 books, which he's claimed to be working on now for quite some time. So it's definitely one of those things. It's definitely one of those situations where they should probably take a couple years off of Game of Thrones, let it simmer, let it die down, and then come back with something. If they're treating this like a prequel show, it kind of feels like Fear the Walking Dead. I honestly can't tell you at this point who watches Fear the Walking Dead, because everyone I know who's watched it hates it. But it's got enough of an audience to where AMC keeps freaking making it. So maybe that's a poor analogy. However, I am curious to know your thoughts and your opinions Let me know down in the comments below. I will talk to you all later. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourself a great day, and peace out.